I have been asked if I could do a little more detail on the vacuum system on our 1973 Mustang with the 302 two-barrel. And this will include vacuum hose routing down to the C4 transmission, which in this particular year Ford used a dual diaphragm vacuum modulator for the transmission. One vacuum line goes to intake manifold, the other one goes to ported vacuum, and then together they exert the kind of pressure on the dual diaphragm manifold to make the modulator work as needed for this particular powertrain. So I'll cover that and some other stuff in this video. I have removed the air cleaner housing, and there's a few different things I want to point out. Some of these things I've covered in other videos, so this might be repetitive to some folks who have seen the earlier videos. There are two thermal vacuum switches on this engine. One of them, way over here, has 3 ports on it. The other one has only 2 ports. This 3-port thermal vacuum switch is the first one I want to talk about. The hoses go to ported vacuum on the top. The middle hose goes to the vacuum advanced diaphragm, and the bottom hose goes to intake manifold vacuum. So the way these things work in this configuration is when the engine is cool or under 230 degrees coolant temperature or thereabouts, the ported vacuum from the carburetor from the top port is directed to the middle port for the vacuum advanced diaphragm. And so when the engine is idling, no vacuum is being sent to the vacuum advanced diaphragm. When a person takes the engine off idle, like accelerating, ported vacuum is then applied from the carburetor to the vacuum advanced diaphragm, and the ignition timing is advanced. That helps with low-end performance and also helps improve fuel economy. If you have bad fuel mileage, one of the first things I would like to do with that car is check to make sure this diaphragm is not ruptured, and then make sure I'm able to get vacuum down here when the throttle is open. If either of those things has a problem, you have poor fuel economy, guarantee it. So, why do we have intake manifold vacuum going to this switch? Well, that goes into the bottom port. If the engine coolant gets too high, I think it's 230 or 235 degrees or something, maybe it's 225, there's a small wax pellet in the bottom of this thermal vacuum switch. It will move and block off the ported vacuum and apply manifold vacuum to the distributor. What that does is it advances the ignition timing to a maximum position, even when idling, and helps cool the engine down. That's the theory. I will go ahead and demonstrate this first with the engine not running for normal or cool temperature, and then I'll show how it works with the engine running. I'm not going to try to test it with a high temperature because I don't feel like making the engine run excessively hot just for a quick demo. You have to take my word for it. The Intake Manifold Vacuum for high temperatures is there for exactly that. What I have done is I have plugged my vacuum test unit into the top port of that 3-port thermal vacuum switch. That's where the carburetor ported vacuum normally goes. And then I plug the vacuum gauge into the center port, which is where normally the vacuum advanced distributor gets plugged into. Now, this is going to take a couple of tries because Linda is not with me today to help video this. I'm doing this all by myself, one hand holding the camera. So I'm going to pause this for a moment. I'll come back. I'm going to apply vacuum to the vacuum tester and then show how on the gauge the vacuum has come through the thermal vacuum switch. Okay, on my gauge I pulled down pretty close to, I think that's about what, 16 inches of mercury or so. And over here on this gauge it's showing it's almost 17 inches of mercury. So these two gauges aren't calibrated for each other, but the point is the vacuum I applied is being applied all the way through to this vacuum gauge and would be applied to the vacuum advanced diaphragm if it were connected. I'm going to release the vacuum a little bit on my test unit, and here you see the vacuum here is dropped also. I'm going to release all of it. So really and truly, that thermal switch is doing something. Okay, now I have plugged my test gauge in to the bottom port of the thermal vacuum switch. I'm going to apply vacuum and then see if it shows up on the vacuum gauge for the distributor or not. Do this really fast because it turns out that the thermal vacuum switch intake manifold side is not able to hold vacuum by itself very well. But the bigger point is what vacuum it does pull does not come through to the distributor unless the engine is very hot. So I'm going to try to do this in a way I can do it one-handed, and so you can still see the effect of what's going on. So the vacuum came up on the gauge, the test gauge, tester unit, but not on the vacuum gauge itself. So that thermal vacuum switch is definitely blocking vacuum from going to intake manifold to the vacuum advanced diaphragm at low temperatures, exactly like it's supposed to do. Okay, the engine is now running, and I'm going to open the throttle, and when I open the throttle, you will see this vacuum gauge start to read inches of mercury of how much vacuum is being applied to ported vacuum. So that's when ported vacuum occurs, when you come off idle. I'll come up a little tiny bit. Beginning more, so the more I open the throttle to a point, the more vacuum I'll get, and the more advanced we'll get on the ignition timing with the advanced distributor vacuum advanced diaphragm. Some more advanced stuff here. I mentioned earlier we have a 3-port vacuum switch and a 2-port vacuum switch. The 2-port vacuum switch is located, so we get the light in place here. I had mentioned earlier we have a 3-port vacuum switch and we have a 2-port vacuum switch. And I touched briefly on what the 2-port switch is for, but now a little more detail. Off the carburetor, we've got a vacuum hose for ported vacuum. It goes in a small plastic or nylon tee. That tee sends some of the vacuum to this top port and the 3-port switch. And when the engine is under 230 degrees or whatever, ported vacuum is then sent to the vacuum advanced diaphragm. The other part of the ported tee goes to the 2-port thermal switch. What it does is when the engine is cold, it keeps vacuum, ported vacuum, from being sent back to the exhaust gas recirculation valve and back to the secondary diaphragm for the transmission vacuum modulator. Once the engine does warm up a little bit, it allows that ported vacuum to flow to those devices. The reason we don't want the exhaust gas recirculation valve working when the engine is cold is because it's putting inert gas, I-N-E-R-T, inert, into the intake manifold in an attempt to fill the combustion chamber with the volume of gases that are not burnable. It cools the engine off, reduces nitrous oxides, etc., but it also can cause a bit of an engine stumble, especially on light acceleration from a stopped position. So to help eliminate having that stumble on a cold engine, the engineers put a thermal switch in there, so only when the engine's warmed up will the exhaust gas recirculation valve gets vacuum. There's a T over here also. That T goes to port position 3 and 4 of that vacuum T I'm showing you. You notice that those two right-hand vacuum lines, 3 and 4, are a little smaller in diameter than the two to the left. Here's what's going on. Ports number 3 and 4, the smaller of the vacuum lines, is going down to the vacuum modulator secondary diaphragm. That doesn't exist in all automatic transmissions. In 1973, it was pretty new, and luckily they did away with that later. Anyway, the two left-hand vacuum ports are bigger. That's because they go to intake manifold on the one hose, and the other hose goes to the primary side of the transmission vacuum modulator. And that has vacuum applied whether the engine is hot, cold, normal, doesn't matter. It gets it. So I'm going to put the car up in the air and try to show where the metal tubes are that connect to the rubber vacuum lines off that 4-port T that go back to the vacuum modulator. Now underneath the 73 Mustang and looking up at the front of the transmission toward the engine, and I'm going to try to point this out while also using the flashlight, but there is a pair of steel lines, a smaller diameter and bigger diameter one, These go up to the rear of the engine compartment. The small one is what gets fed ported vacuum. The big one gets manifold vacuum. And where those end up going is further back in the transmission. We have the transmission modulator valve. Now, in this case, we have a dual diaphragm modulator. I can tell from the shape of it. I don't know if I can get a good view of how it looks when it's installed because it's so tight in there, but I'll try. The big, thicker vacuum line goes to the rear port of the vacuum modulator, which is the bigger of the two diameters. Now I'm going to see if I can get a better view of the transmission vacuum modulator from the passenger side of the vehicle. You will see two vacuum hoses leading to the modulator. The forward hose with the yellow stripe is the ported vacuum hose. The larger one at the rear is intake manifold. So that's where those vacuum lines go. In the event someone used to have a two-stage modulator that has been replaced by a one diaphragm modulator, you do not need or want ported vacuum going down there. You want only manifold vacuum, intake manifold vacuum, going down to the only port at the rear of the modulator. The ported vacuum line has to be blocked off. You can't just leave it hanging out there open. Otherwise, you won't get adequate port vacuum to the vacuum advanced distributor, which shares the port vacuum source from the carburetor. And if you care about the exhaust gas recirculation valve working, it won't work either if that is not blocked off for the transmission, if the second diaphragm design isn't there.